Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we really need the help from the others, especially when we are not feeling too well, or we have just gone through an operation or even gave birth. Then we really rely on the help from the doctors and nurses around us. But what if I told you that even during our lowest of times, there is something evil lurking out there that is just waiting for its turn to pounce? For those who are new to my channel, then please welcome. I am all about telling scary true stories that really happened in real life, and I'd be very surprised if you have heard of any of them. I do have to warn you though, a lot of the content I describe is very graphic, and so please bear that in mind before you go viewing any of my content on here. Today's story is called Little Angels, and let's dive right into it. It was a cold day in September 1936 when a little girl named Maria was born. She didn't know it yet, but her family was often struggling to get by, and her parents' marriage wasn't the happiest. As Maria was growing up in the little town of Sušice in the Czech Republic, her father, who was originally of German background and even supported the Nazis during the Second World War, started drinking heavily and was lashing out at Maria and her younger brother all the time. Maria's younger brother was born with severe mental problems, and so adding to all the stress at home, he would constantly terrorize Maria, so the little girl really didn't have anywhere to turn to for support. As Maria got to her teenage years, she started lashing back, particularly at her mother, whom she started calling names and even hit from time to time. Maria was really starting to show her vicious and abusive side, but only to the people that were closest to her. But on the outside, Maria was actually well liked. She was doing great at school and was making friends just like any other child her age was, so nobody was really suspecting that behind closed doors, Maria could be such a cruel person. As Maria was going through her studies, one of her teachers mentioned to her that she should consider a career as a nurse. She was such a promising student and always was there for the others, so this teacher thought that this job would be perfect for her. Maria gave it some thought and started looking into this more, and in the end, she was practically excelling at all her exams and got amazing grades, so she decided to apply for a place at the medical school located in Klatovy. And again, during her studies, Maria continued to be a wonderful student, and so in 1955, she graduated with honors and immediately was accepted as a nurse at the hospital in her hometown of Sušice. For a couple of years, it almost looked like Maria's life was finally coming together. She really liked her job and quickly became adored by all the staff and patients alike. And she even met a new man named Lumír Fikáček, whom she soon married. Lumír worked as a military man at the Czech-Austrian border, and he quickly fell in love with Maria as she came across as such a good person. The couple even started planning kids together, but they both agreed to wait a little bit longer as their current living situation wasn't the most ideal. Maria's mother moved in with them a year earlier as Maria's father had passed away. And since their home was confiscated by the Czech government, she had nowhere to go. This was a common practice under the communist government, especially if it was in relation to people of German origin. Usually the families would be allowed to live in the house until they passed, but their kids would have no right to the house after that, and they could not buy it from the state even if they wanted to. This actually happened within my family. It was my mother's grandparents' house, and after they passed, we had to give it up immediately. As you can probably already imagine, soon cracks began to show in Maria's marriage. She was getting more and more agitated and was losing interest to spend any time with her husband, who now began seeing Maria's true colors. In 1957, so 2 years after Maria started working at the hospital, she was reassigned to the maternity ward, and so she started caring for newborns and very young babies. To everyone, Maria was the perfect nurse, and so the chief medical, Dr. Hemmel, thought that she would really excel on the ward as she was so nice and always wanted to help everyone. Dr. Hemmel even thought that, if all goes well, Maria could become the head nurse and help inspire other nurses working at that hospital. But Maria didn't like her new ward at all. One morning, Maria arrived at her work in a very bad mood. As she stepped into the room with all the babies, she was suddenly hit with their cries and screams, and that made Maria very angry. She knew that she needed to get through her morning duties as quickly as she could, so she could leave that room and go on to tend to her other duties. But all the crying around her was getting so loud that Maria picked up a few days old girl named Jana, grabbed her by her ear and pulled on it so hard that she almost tore it off. The girl's ear started bleeding profusely, and so Maria knew that she would need to notify the staff and do something about it. So, with the crying girl in her arms, she sped walk to Dr. Hemmel's office and made up a story of how she must have grabbed the girl's ear by mistake when she was picking her up with a blanket still covering her, and so that way she managed to accidentally hurt the little girl. And because Maria, who was well liked and never had an accident like this before, Dr. Hemmel believed her. He told her to bring the girl to the surgery where her ear would be stitched and urge her to be more careful next time, but that was the end of that. And so Maria, now feeling that she was so easily left off the hook, thought that in the future it might be very easy to get away with autocrams like this one again. And unfortunately, she would be right. Some weeks later, Maria was in the middle of changing all the baby's diapers when a small boy she was currently handling grabbed the edge of the baby's scales as he was reaching for something to play with. Maria, who was already feeling pretty agitated that morning, violently grabbed the boy and pulled him away from the scales he was still holding onto. And all of a sudden, Maria heard this loud snap, and the baby boy started screaming from pain. She panicked as she knew what she had just done, but she still decided to leave the boy there and offer no help. A few hours later, another nurse came into the ward and noticed that the boy's arm was angled in a weird way, and so she would try to move it, but that only made the boy scream from pain again. And so the nurse rushed him in for the x-ray, where it would turn out that the boy's humerus, which is the bone in your upper arm, had been snapped. The nurse claimed that the boy's arm had been bent in an odd angle when she got to the ward, so it definitely couldn't have been her doing. And so with no obvious explanation, the boy's arm was put into a cast, and everyone decided that they must have overlooked his injury after he had been born, even though his medical records indicated that he was completely well and healthy after the birth. On the 17th February 1960, a mother of one was hospitalized, and so the baby girl named Hannah was put into the maternity ward together with the newborns. Hannah had been born in the same hospital just a month earlier, and so the doctors agreed to have her there so she could be close to her mother while she was still recovering. But only a couple of days later, the baby was being handled by Maria again, when Maria got this sudden urge to lash out, and so she hit the baby with her fist to the back of her head. The girl started loudly crying, but Maria would later confess that, apart from that, she visibly looked healthy, which must have been because she was already a month old, and so much stronger than any of the other newborn babies on the ward. Even though that this didn't harm little Hannah, what Maria did to her a few days later, that would. On the 23rd February, so 5 days later after Hannah was put into the maternity ward, Maria was getting overwhelmed at work. There were 2 babies, a boy and a girl, born that morning, and they were also assigned to Maria, and so her hands were completely full. The baby girl kept crying constantly, which was really making Maria mad. And when Maria could no longer take it, she grabbed the girl's head and started sinking her fingers deeper into the girl's skull. As the girl was less than a day old, her skull was still very soft, and so it was very easy for Maria to not break any bones while she was doing this, as they haven't had the time to harden yet. And Maria knew that what she had just done to her would most likely lead to some severe disability. But again, Maria just pretended like nothing happened and went on about her day on the ward. She went on to do the laundry, made herself coffee, she had a lunch, and then in the afternoon, when she returned to the maternity ward to check on the babies, she could still see that the newborn girl she had attacked that morning was still not moving, and only then she went on to report it. When the doctor arrived to check on the little girl, he unfortunately quickly found out that there was nothing he could do for her. The girl had already died, and so the only thing he could do was to take the girl into the morgue and order a full autopsy to help them find out what actually caused her death. But this tragedy was not the only one to happen that day. In the afternoon, when Maria stepped into the ward, she was again hit with the baby's cries, and by this point, she could not stand it anymore. She did ask to be relocated onto a different ward so many times now, but that still hasn't happened, and so for now, Maria was getting angrier and angrier by the day. She walked over to the bed where little Hannah laid, and from absolutely nowhere, Maria started repeatedly hitting Hannah's head. The girl kept crying and wriggling in Maria's arms, but she was not letting go of the girl. She just continued to hit her as if the little girl was her punching bag. When Maria had enough, she put Hannah back to her bed and walked away from the ward to make herself some more coffee. Unfortunately for Hannah, she would succumb to her injuries a few days later. As this was now the second death of a baby at the same maternity ward, the doctors had a suspicion that something else must be at play. Something like this has never happened to them before, and so they ordered a full autopsy of the second child to see if they could get a better idea about what might have caused her death. Hannah was already over a month old, and so any complications from birth would be highly unlikely to surface now. Plus, when she had been born at a hospital, she left it happy and healthy, so it made no sense to the doctors that she passed away so suddenly. When the autopsy was conducted, the hospital senior Dr. Hamill brought a report into his office, and he also took the report of the other girl who passed away just a few days before Hannah. Dr. Hamill laid both the reports next to one another and began reading Hannah's one. He wanted to make sure that he wouldn't overlook anything, and so Dr. Hamill decided to directly compare both of the autopsies and see if there were any similarities. But when Dr. Hamill got to the cause of death, he frowned as it was not something he expected to read. Both girls died from severe head and brain trauma. On top of that, the little newborn girl had also had both of her arms broken. That seemed highly unlikely to Dr. Hamill, as he couldn't explain how such injuries could have happened while the girls were being handled. He knew that all his staff were very careful when handling babies, and so how could this be? But then Dr. Hamill remembered that one incident where one of his nurses, Maria, came running to him with a baby in her arms that needed stitches for her ear. Dr. Hamill also pictured that day when one of his other nurses brought in a boy with that fractured arm. And when he looked closely at who was working on the ward that day, Maria's name popped up again. Dr. Hamill really didn't like the idea that was forming in his head, but even he couldn't deny the facts. And so Dr. Hamill decided to contact the police and ask for their help with the investigation. When two local detectives took the case, they got stuck right in. They went over every single detail and report they had received, and also looked at their own notes. And soon they concluded that there was one obvious suspect. So they did some more digging, but ultimately on the 27th of February 1960, arrived at the hospital to arrest Maria. After Maria was brought in, the detectives began with her interrogation, where she would fully admit to hurting those two girls that would later pass away. But she would also confess to hurting at least 10 other children that had been in her care since she started working at that maternity ward. This really shocked the police. They had never come across someone so calm in how they described all their crimes. And to think that these were babies that were completely defenseless, everyone was just so taken aback by all of this. Maria would then go on to say that she just hated the baby's cries and screams, and that her emotions and anger became much more intense during her monthly periods. She continued on to say that during those times, she was convinced that she would even hurt her own child if she had any, just to take her anger out on someone that couldn't fight back. Maria was well aware of all the pain and suffering she had caused, and she knew that those kids she hurt would most likely end up with lifelong illnesses. But even that didn't stop her. She just continued hurting the babies whenever her anger levels would spike. In the end, Maria admitted that on the day of her arrest, she was actually relieved that the police finally came for her. Based on everything Maria said to the police, a psychologist would also meet up with her, and she would undergo a series of tests and examinations. And in the end, the psychologist would testify that even though Maria had obvious anger issues and was also prone to episodes of depression and hysteria, he would ultimately find her mentally stable enough to answer for her crimes. And so Maria was found guilty of killing 2 small babies. Even though Maria confessed to hurting at least 10 more children, due to the lack of evidence, this was officially never taken into the account by the court. However, Maria did end up being sentenced to death by hanging, and this was executed in a cellar of Pankrácz prison in Prague on the 13th of April 1961. And so this brings us to the end of our story. I know this was another really heavy one, but I really wanted to tell you about this because I'm sure that it is still happening out there with all the stories about, babies being swapped and babies coming home with mysterious bruises and illnesses. We really need to talk about stuff like that a bit more. So please let me know what you think of it, or maybe you have heard of something like that happen to one of your friends or even read about it on the news. I'd be really interested to know. With that, I will all see you next Friday again with a brand new episode. But in the meantime, I've got another story for you that I think will really freak you out. Link for it is up there. Until next time.